Today's episode is dedicated to Ahnenerbe, the secret weapon of the Reich, a super mystical, clandestine order, but in reality, a scientific research institute, an organization shrouded in perhaps the greatest number of myths, legends, and conspiracy theories of all the institutions of the Third Reich. I first heard about Ahnenerbe during my first year studying history. The scene at the institute was as follows. We had a seminar led by guest lecturers from Moscow State University, and it was dedicated to weapons, the development of weapons through different eras, from antiquity to the present day. One or two of these seminars were taught by a professor, whose name I can't recall, who was about 70 years old at the time. He was a war veteran who had taken part in the capture of Berlin. During a conversation with his students, he shared that he had participated in the assault on the Reich Chancellery in Berlin in the spring of 1945. There, he saw strange corpses, people of Asian appearance dressed in SS uniforms, but with some sort of orange cloaks draped over them. It was unclear where they came from, and there were several such bodies. Later, I read many times about the theory that the bodies of Buddhist monks were found under the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. What were they doing there? How did they end up there? And were they actually there? Of course, we'll never know for sure, but the connection between Nazi Germany and Tibet is undeniable, and I'll talk about that later. All of this was tied to Ahnenerbe. This organization was declared criminal at the Nuremberg Trials because the stories about inventing flying saucers, paranormal abilities, telekinesis, and other mystical things that Ahnenerbe was involved in are one part of the story. And today we'll cover that extensively. The other part of the story involves the inhumane experiments conducted in concentration camps on prisoners, experiments on blood clotting, frostbite, and so on. In other words, this organization caused an enormous number of victims. I'll talk about that today as well. So, let's discuss what Ahnenerbe really was. The history of the Third Reich is deeply intertwined with mysticism and occultism. If you watch documentary footage of the Nuremberg rallies of the Nazi Party, NSDP, you'll see torchlit processions in the shape of swastikas, banners hanging, and columns arranged in formation. It all resembles a spectacle, some kind of mystical, ritualistic act. It's obvious to the naked eye. This was, of course, different from anything happening in other countries. Nothing like this existed in the Soviet Union, the United States, or Great Britain. But in Germany, it was there. When you watch this footage, whether shot by Leni Riefenstahl or from any other chronicle, you see that it's a very dark, very mystical, occult event unfolding before your eyes. Where did it all come from? One could argue that the German nation has always been inclined toward mysticism. Yes, we can talk about philosophy, we can talk about culture. In reality, any person is drawn to the dark side, to the unknown, to mysticism and occultism. The Germans were no exception, but perhaps they stood out among other European nations in this regard. Although, let's be honest, in the Russian Empire, in the final years of the Romanov dynasty, occultism was flourishing wildly as well, from Rasputin to Helena Blavatsky. Sorry, I mean, we too were obsessed with Tibet, higher powers, and so forth. In 1918, the First World War ended. Germany lost, and Germany needed a rallying point. Germany could have taken different paths. It could have gone down the communist road, but it didn't. Occultism was quite widespread among the elites. In 1918, an organization called the Thule Society was founded in Munich. The myth of the Atlanteans would be developed and given a completely monstrous explanation in Hitler's Germany. So, in 1918, an occultist, mystic, and conspiracist named Rudolf von Sewitendorf created the Thule Society. It attracted Munich intellectuals who were interested in and eager to engage with this mysticism. What was the purpose of this society, and why was it created? The Atlanteans, to put it simply, after Atlantis sank, supposedly moved to a place called Thule, which is vaguely located, perhaps closer to Iceland, perhaps closer to Greenland, somewhere in the Scandinavian region. So, they moved there, and they gave rise to the Aryan race. If you've seen 17 Moments of Spring, you'll remember that in the personal files, there's always that note, true Aryan, Nordic character. When I was 10 years old, I had no idea what that meant. According to the Thule Society, true Aryans were the descendants of the Atlanteans. They were considered the main race on Earth, and the Germans were their primary descendants, born from these Atlanteans, these Hyperboreans, this great, crucial Nordic civilization. The Germans were their chief heirs, and the search for these roots and connections was the philosophy of the Thule Society. The society was undoubtedly illogical and racist, because then a man named Herman Wirth appeared, who wrote a work called The Origin of Humanity. What did it say? There was a Nordic race that created everything beautiful on Earth, invented language, and created culture. Then came the southern Gondwana, where all sorts of subhumans lived, from black people to Slavs. These were second-tier people who adopted the Nordic language, distorted it, and, through interbreeding with Nordic people, degraded humanity. The Germans, however, more or less preserved their purity as descendants of this dominant race, and therefore, the Germans needed to unite to maintain this racial purity and prove that they were the primary people on Earth, the superhumans. This was an absolutely scientific, in quotes, theory, supported by cherry-picked evidence, and, as we'll see, it was taken quite seriously and embraced by German elites. It's not like this was a group of charlatans, frauds, or madmen, though there were some of those in the Thule Society as well. Not at all. There were Munich professors, major industrialists, and, for example, a man named Otto Rahn. I mentioned him partially in a program about the Cathars and the Albigensian Wars. He conducted excavations in France at Montségur, the last stronghold of the Cathars, searching for the Holy Grail, firmly believing it had been brought there. He was a well-known archaeologist, and this is how the Munich elite, the German elite, began to be infused with the ideas of the Thule Society. On one hand, Germany was living in a state of national humiliation, and this mythology about being descendants of a superior race resonated strongly. On the other hand, those who would later become key figures in the Nazi Party started joining the Thule Society. Rudolf Hess got involved first. How? There was a professor in the Thule Society named Karl Haushofer, and Rudolf Hess, his assistant, joined the society, became enamored with the ideas of Aryan superiority and German national dominance, and eventually brought Hitler into the fold. Hitler was deeply influenced by these ideas. There's ongoing debate about whether Hitler genuinely believed in this mysticism or simply used it. We won't delve into that because, frankly, whether Hitler was a complete monster who committed his crimes rationally or under the influence of mysticism is irrelevant to us now. The key point is that he was part of it. Hans Frank, a future Nazi war criminal, also joined the Thule Society. At this intersection of mysticism, Nazism, and occultism, as the Nazi movement rose, the German Workers' Party was formed. At the same time, the swastika appeared. If you look at the swastika now, we immediately associate it with Hitler's Germany and nothing else. But in reality, it's a much older symbol. It first appeared in Buddhist texts, in Hinduism, in the East, and in China. The swastika is still used today. If you visit Bali or India, you'll see it in ornamental designs. It's a protective symbol, a sign of prosperity and well-being. The swastika first appeared in the Thule Society and later migrated to the symbolism of the German Workers' Party. As Hitler grew stronger as a politician, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDP, was formed. The swastika, placed in a white circle on a red flag, was personally approved by Hitler and became the standard of Nazi Germany, first as a party symbol, then as a state one. This, too, was an occult symbol, not drawn from the depths of German philosophy, but from Tibetan philosophy. So, the Thule Society developed, while Hitler's rise to political power continued, and all these people were closely intertwined. At the turn of the 1920s, our main figure today, so to speak, entered this circle, Heinrich Himmler. This man was searching for a new foundation, a new philosophy for himself. He had been a Catholic, but at some point realized that religion gave him nothing, so he started looking for new anchors and ended up in the Thule Society circle, becoming deeply influenced by its ideas. Himmler, as we know, was the main figure responsible for the Holocaust, the one who signed the orders for the extermination of people and the final solution to the Jewish question. This philosophy suited him perfectly, as the Thule society was fiercely anti-Semitic. They published a newspaper in Munich called Völkischer Beobachter, which later became the main press organ of Nazi Germany. It was an utterly anti-Semitic rag, claiming that Jews were a blight on the German nation, responsible for losing the war and controlling everything. All the nonsense you could hear from an anti-Semite was fully spelled out and justified there, crafted by educated people. Himmler loved it and immersed himself in it. From childhood, Himmler was apparently drawn to occultism and mysticism. At some point, either on his own or influenced by someone, he began to see himself as the reincarnation of Henry the Fowler, the German leader who first united the Germanic tribes. He would nurture this belief, and you'll see where it led. In short, there were two parallel streams, the occult mystical and the National Socialist, tightly connected because it was one big clique. In 1935, Herman Wirth, whom I mentioned earlier, held an exhibition called The Legacy of German Ancestors. It showcased in full splendor artifacts found in excavations, stones, runes, proving the dominance of the Germanic civilization. It claimed that the Germanic civilization gave the world everything. It also planted the seed that Christianity, which spread across Europe, stifled the Germans because their pre-Christian, pagan sacred sites were destroyed. The nation was suppressed. Himmler visited this exhibition and loved it. By 1935, the Nazis were in power, and Himmler was the head of the SS, Hitler's personal guard. He took the exhibition and the Legacy of German Ancestors Society, Ahnenerbe, under his wing, saying, "This is all great." Why did this resonate so much with Himmler? Because just claiming we're Aryans, we have a Nordic character, and that's why we're superior, is fine, but it's not enough. You need a scientific foundation. This occult, mystical movement, searching for the beliefs of ancient Germans and evidence of their presence in Europe, was perfect for propaganda. He took it under his wing, Wirth became the president of Ahnenerbe, and they began working hand in hand. At the same time, a man named Richard Darr, the Minister of Agriculture, attended the exhibition. He had already written a work called Blood and Soil, about the villages of ancient Germans and the true roots of the German spirit, and this resonated with him as well. Here, we need a brief digression. On one hand, we understand that Hitler was somewhat influenced by mysticism, but probably to a lesser extent. Himmler, however, was fully immersed in it, the reincarnation of Henry the Fowler, creating a new religion, the Black Order of the SS, a monastic brotherhood. All of this would emerge later. But most importantly, we can't claim that they were all mystics and occultists who believed in this with their sick minds. Of course, some were like that, but there were also plenty of charlatans around. How do these mystical practices work? If they see a client willing to believe, they start selling it to them immediately, and the client eagerly buys it. We know in modern life that big businessmen often have fortune tellers, magicians, or astrologers surrounding them with this aura of legends, beliefs, natal charts, and so on. We see this as prevalent now, and it was even more so back then. For example, a man named Karl Maria Willigut appeared in Himmler's circle. He was from old German aristocracy, but also a former patient of a psychiatric hospital. What did he tell everyone? That his lineage traced back to Thor, the Norse god with the hammer. Himmler loved the story because Willigut was involved in excavations, claiming there were numerous ancient Germanic sanctuaries and artifacts that granted powers like levitation and telekinesis. Himmler supported all of this. Alongside him was Wirth, who justified it with ancient texts. Then there was the story with runes. If you look at the SS symbol, it's two Zig runes. These are Scandinavian runes that were very common in Germany. They weren't just used in the SS, they appeared on the chevrons of various regiments. This flourished because runes weren't just ancient Scandinavian letters, they were amulets, mystical symbols. Himmler loved it when he was shown that combining two Zig runes could serve as both the SS logo and a powerful protective amulet. Naturally, he eagerly believed it. Everything was fine until 1936. In 1936, Hitler unleashed fierce criticism on Hermann Wirth, the head of Ahnenerbe. He said, "We're building a completely different future here. To hell with Atlanteans and mysticism. Why are you confusing people? The Aryan nation, I understand, but all your occultism and runes are nonsense. This is your thing, Himmler." But he considered Himmler reliable because Hitler called him Loyal Heinrich. He was an excellent courtier, a brilliant manager, skilled at bureaucracy and intrigue, and very effective. So, Hitler valued him but knew he had this quirk in his head. He was fine with him dabbling in it separately, but he shouldn't spread it across the entire Third Reich, as it confused people. Wirth faced severe criticism from Hitler. Himmler realized this wouldn't end well, and in 1937, he expelled Wirth from Ahnenerbe and became its head himself. He transformed Ahnenerbe from a society for studying German ancestral heritage into a scientific research institute that would encompass all spheres of German society. Ahnenerbe became a scientific research institute. Here's a list of departments I'll mention now, but there were actually 3 more pages of departments, just to show how deeply they penetrated every aspect of German society. The astronomy department studied celestial bodies, not a critical structure, but it existed. The biology department worked on improving the human body, medicine, and so on. The botany department dealt with breeding and selecting new plants, from wheat to oats. The geology and mineralogy department studied soils and more. This was important for building secret bunkers and testing grounds, but also, for example, they conducted an expedition to Lake Ritsa in Abkhazia before the war with the Soviet Union. They took water samples, and the water was deemed so good that they were enthusiastic about creating blood plasma, believing it was ideal for that purpose. That's the kind of research they did. The excavation department dug across Germany and later in occupied territories, searching for traces of ancient Germans, sanctuaries, remains of sacrificial fires, weapons, and agricultural tools, to piece together the heritage of the German nation. The German art department aimed to prove that German art had dominated Europe since ancient times. That department was shut down in 1938. The heraldry department, of course, how could you have new knights without coats of arms? They traced ancestors back to the 8th or 10th generation and designed crusts. A brief digression. There's a story about a German actress who told Himmler, "You talk about knights, blue-eyed, tall blondes, true Germans who defeated the Roman Empire and fought Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest." But look at the Reich's leadership. Himmler looks like a monkey, Hitler's a scrawny little guy. Why don't you look very Aryan? They replied, "But we're Aryan in spirit." A strange story, but it happened. There was a department for studying Indo-Germanic and Finnish connections. The Germans sought fragments of the Aryan race worldwide, in Scandinavia, Tibet, Finland, and the Baltics, proving they were part of a great Aryan proto-civilization. There was a meteorology department, a department for maps and caves studying ancient Germanic cave settlements, a plant genetics department, and departments for studying sagas and legends, as they contain the power and mystical beliefs of ancient Germans that could be applied today. There were bizarre theories, like swords found in the Teutoburg forest that, if held, could connect you to your ancestors. It sounds like nonsense, but people promoted it seriously. There was a department for inhabited mound settlements, more excavations in Germany searching for traces of ancient civilizations. An occult sciences department, obvious what it did. A department for witches, very interesting because Christianity was an obstacle for the Third Reich, and they wanted to create a new religion. Himmler eagerly played along, selling it to Hitler that Germans needed a new religion, not Christianity, but a return to paganism. They collected evidence of witches burned across Europe to portray them as wise women who helped people, but Christians burned them to suppress German civilization, spirit, and spirituality. They compiled a catalog of 35,000 witches burned across Europe over the past 400 years. An expeditions department handled expeditions. A mathematics department, Department M, was involved in creating the V-2 rocket. And a national affairs department dealt with Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Britain, and so on. Himmler had a clear plan to integrate Ahnenerbe as a scientific research institute into propaganda, religion, children's education, schools, universities, and party cells. This way, they would oversee the spirituality and ideological foundation of the Third Reich. I think, and many agree, Himmler saw himself as Hitler's successor, building the SS from Hitler's Guard units into a massive second army. He created his religion, his almost monastic Black Order, to eventually lead the Third Reich after defeating the Soviet Union. We'll win the war, Hitler will be old, and I'll take over. He was building the foundation for his rule. Returning to the Tibetan monks, were they under the Reich Chancellery's ruins or not? I don't know, and no one knows for sure. But what we do know is that the SS sent an expedition to Tibet, led by Ernst Schaeffer, an expert in Hinduism and Tibetan studies. In 1938, this expedition went to Tibet. An important detail: one Dalai Lama had died, and the next hadn't yet taken office, so there was a window of opportunity. Excuse the informal phrase, and the Germans were welcomed in Lhasa, Tibet's capital. They were shown ancient artifacts and conducted their main task, finding a connection between the ancient Tibetan civilization and the Aryan civilization, the supposed ancestors of the German nation. They collected artifacts, were gifted ancient manuscripts, and took high-altitude Tibetan wheat that ripens in 60 days in poor soil to plant in the Reich's territories. They measured skulls, obsessed with proving Aryan and non-Aryan skull structures, trying to show that Tibetan and German skulls were part of the same great Aryan formation. They established a radio link between Lhasa and Berlin that operated until the war's end. There's a myth that they were searching for Shambhala, a secret place that grants superpowers, moving in parallel worlds, attacking from them, and operating in 3 dimensions. They were completely absorbed by this mysticism. Of course, they didn't find Shambhala, but the expedition returned to Berlin. The Tibetans gifted ancient manuscripts, pottery, and a Tibetan mastiff to Hitler, which, I believe, died en route. A film called Secret Tibet was made about the trip and shown in Nazi Germany cinemas, claiming that Tibet, its lamas, and its occultism were part of the German nation. Look at their aggressive dances. Our aggression and expansion of living space are in our blood. Another expedition in 1938 went to the Middle East, also searching for artifacts of this ancient civilization. A third expedition in 1938 to 1939 went to Iceland, studying Viking heritage, also considered part of the German nation, runes, runic stones, amulets, and so forth. Additionally, the SS seriously taught rune reading and the study of the Edda, the Old Norse epic, exclusively to its members. They also lectured SS members that their ruthlessness toward prisoners was rooted in ancient Germans drowning homosexuals, the mentally ill, and traitors in bogs. We've always been an aggressive nation expanding our territory, so be worthy of your ancestors. There was also a man Himmler liked, a Finn born in Germany named Urjo von Gronhagen. He translated the ancient Karelian epic Kalevala, finding traces of this ancient Germanic civilization. Himmler loved it and sent him to Karelia to search for traces of this civilization and compile a catalogue of witches, which reached 30,000 entries by the war's end. They studied occult abilities, telekinesis, telepathy, hypnosis, all meticulously researched. Obviously, there were many frauds and charlatans, but some believed in it seriously. In 1940, a similar expedition went to the Baltics, searching for traces of the ancient Teutons, as the Teutonic Order had operated in Prussia and the Baltics. They believed this knowledge wasn't lost, passed from ancient Germans to medieval knights, then to the Teutonic Order, and partially to the Freemasons. They collected everything from crystal skulls, which I discussed in episodes about Mexican civilizations, to the Holy Grail, which they tried to excavate in Montségur, France. These artifacts were gathered in Berlin to harness their supposed magical, mystical properties to empower the new, mighty Third Reich civilization. Schaeffer, who led the Tibetan expedition, went to the Caucasus in 1942 during the war, conducting excavations. About 7 years ago, a mysterious chest with Ahnenerbe symbols was found in Adygia, containing 2 alien skulls. It turned out they were deer skulls missing frontal lobes, accidentally placed in the chest, which was indeed from a 1942 Ahnenerbe expedition. The Germans dug into the mountains, searching for mystical elements. In 1942, another Ahnenerbe expedition went to Crimea, then occupied by Nazi forces. Why Crimea? Because the Gothic tribes' invasion of Europe, which attacked the Roman civilization, were considered ancient Germans. Crimea was a key part of the Gothic kingdom, so they excavated ancient human sites to find artifacts of our German nation. Of course, it led nowhere, but they had an ambitious plan to turn Crimea into a resort island for the Third Reich's elite. They sent oak trees, true German trees, and special wheat for Aryans to eat, planning a resort for top officials and party elites. Funding was allocated, but Crimea was lost to the Soviet army, and Germany lost the war, so these plans never materialized. Still, they seriously searched for the Gothic kingdom, excavating everything. By the start of the war, Otto Rahn finished his excavations at Monsegur. There's a story that when he returned from France, he declared a copper vessel, or cube, for distilling liquids at Swiss customs. There's a legend that he found the Holy Grail and brought it to Germany. We'll never know. Otto Rahn's fate was tragic. He became disillusioned with Nazism as Hitler's actions in Europe began, was sent to a concentration camp, and either died there, was killed, or, according to one version, escaped and lived under a new identity. By this time, Hermann Wirth was no longer head of Ahnenerbe, ousted after Hitler's criticism. Himmler personally took over the institute, with Wolfram Sievers as the main administrator, holding all the power. Sievers, who was later hanged after the Nuremberg Trials, was responsible for all of Ahnenerbe's atrocities in concentration camps. I'll talk about that shortly. These were the Third Reich's expeditions. Nazis scoured the world, collecting mystical artifacts supposedly belonging to the German nation. These artifacts were meant to be united, channeling the mystical power of ancestors into the new human. The Germans were already obsessed with breeding a new human. Himmler organized the SS as a monastic order. SS members were selected based on lineage, proving their ancestry back to 1800. To marry, they had to prove their wife's lineage to ensure no Jews or subhumans were involved. They aimed to create a new race of tall, blue-eyed blondes through selective breeding. SS weddings weren't just civil or church ceremonies, they were special rituals attended by party officials. Children were to be conceived during the spring or winter solstice, as ancient Germans supposedly did. This mishmash of mystical, conspiratorial theories, like those flourishing on YouTube among anti-vaxxers, was taken very seriously, with strict regulations. Himmler was deeply concerned with, first, annihilating Jews who hindered the German nation, second, breeding this new master race, and third, creating a new religion. He was building his own vision of a new civilization, which I believe he intended to lead after Hitler's death. To wrap up the mysticism and move to the horrific practical aspects, let's talk about artifacts. The Germans searched for them everywhere. As I mentioned, they sought the Holy Grail at Monsegur, the Cathars' last refuge. They looked for crystal skulls in Latin America. An expedition to Lake Titicaca was planned for the 1940s, but was cancelled due to the war. There was a project called Thor's Hammer. That madman, Karl Maria Willigut, who traced his lineage to Thor, proposed a scientific project claiming Thor's hammer was a powerful electric weapon. Ahnenerbe worked on creating an electric weapon to harness lightning energy, disable enemy equipment without artillery, and so on. This project was funded and called Thor's Hammer. Another project was Rheingold, based on an ancient Germanic legend. Using Aryan technology, they believed gold could be extracted from the Rhine's waters. This project was funded but later shut down. There was the Spear of Longinus project, the spear that pierced Jesus, with one version kept in Vienna. During the Anschluss, it was taken to Germany, declared the true Spear of Longinus, also known as the Spear of Destiny, as seen in my childhood game Wolfenstein. Whoever possessed it was said to rule the world. A copy was made, and one was given to Himmler, who placed it in his castle. We'll talk about the castle separately to close the mystical arc. While some searched for Shambhala and translated the Kalevala or compiled witch catalogs, another part of Ahnenerbe dealt with very practical, horrific things, medicine and science. The Germans were focused on several areas. First, finding a cure for cancer, turning to ancient Germanic homeopathy, botany, and herbs, researching a mysterious Aryan tea that healed wounds. One person involved was Philip Luciferberg, a botanist studying homeopathy and how herbs could treat cancer. No cure was found, as Germans continued dying from cancer during and after the war. This was relatively harmless. But then there was August Hirt, infamous for studying the effects of gas on humans. Concentration camp prisoners were subjected to experiments, how much gas a person could withstand, whether an antidote could save them after a dose. I'm simplifying, as I'm not a doctor and don't want to delve too deeply. All experiments were on prisoners. Hirt, a rabid anti-Semite, used pseudoscience to prove Aryan superiority, measuring skulls in his Strasbourg lab. When Allied troops arrived, they found bodies in formalin used for pseudo-medical purposes, with skulls of Jews measured to prove racial inferiority. Another man, Edouard May, studied entomology, parasites, rats, cockroaches, and insects. He developed biological weapons for the Third Reich, nearly completing them by the war's end. Those archives and blueprints disappeared, which we'll discuss later. Heinz Brücker worked on plant genetics, aiming to create more fertile wheat, potatoes, and tomatoes to address food shortages. He claimed Germans would never face food deficits due to his plant genetics work. He partly developed his own research, but also stole the archive of Soviet geneticist Vavilov, who was persecuted in the USSR. Brücker built his work on Vavilov's research. He wasn't tried after the war, continued working in botany and fertilizers, and died in Argentina at 71, killed on his farm, allegedly for developing a parasite that destroyed cocaine plantations, angering the Colombian mafia. Alex Berg, another so-called homeopath, worked on herbs to heal wounds and developed a comradely tea, likely a sham, but he pursued it. The most horrific figure was Sigmund Rascher, who worked in Dachau and corresponded personally with Himmler. He studied hypothermia, freezing prisoners and attempting to revive them with Aryan tea or hot water to see how quickly someone near death could recover. This was vital for the front. There was a theory that human warmth could revive a frozen person faster. Countless people died. He also conducted barrow chamber experiments, simulating low pressure, with only 2 out of 200 surviving. These were crucial for the submarine fleet and aviation. Rascher also inflicted wounds to test blood clotting in combat, with victims bleeding out. He claimed to cure infertility in German women, saying his wife gave birth at 49 and 52 due to a miracle drug. But in the 1940s, his wife was caught trying to kidnap a baby in Munich. An investigation revealed the children were stolen, not born, and Rascher made no gynecological breakthroughs. Both were sent to a concentration camp. His wife hanged herself, and Rascher was shot in the head a day before the Allies arrived, possibly to cover tracks. Ahnenerbe truly spanned all layers. Some fueled the Aryan myth with mysticism, others conducted practical experiments to support the front and tactical medicine. Himmler often attended Ahnenerbe's scientific councils, deeply involved as president. Who funded it all? Ahnenerbe had phenomenal funding. They attracted young scientists with good pay. Projects like Rheingold were quickly shut down, but serious work in botany, medicine, and disaster medicine was well funded, drawing many young German scientists. The Reichsbank partially funded the institute, but significant sums came from the circle of Himmler's friends, industrialists and manufacturers who, at Nuremberg, claimed to be apolitical. The biggest donors were Daimler-Benz and BMW, providing grants and financing these experiments. It likely worked like this. Himmler's men demanded money from Mercedes, who couldn't refuse, but Mercedes and BMW also benefited from military contracts and slave labor from concentration camps. It was mutually beneficial. Where was Hitler in all this? It's easy to portray him as a mystical madman, but he was a talented, intelligent, and practical man, according to eyewitnesses. He supported Himmler where it suited him, creating a new Aryan race and religion, as he didn't believe in Christianity and thought Germans needed a new faith. Beyond that, he wasn't interested. Himmler crafted a theory of higher powers backing Hitler, presenting it to him as a mission, not just power-grabbing. Hitler liked it, and Himmler played on it successfully. But I believe Himmler genuinely believed in it, portraying himself as Hitler's loyal dog, loyal Heinrich, while secretly building a new German civilization for himself. In 1934, the story of Wilsberg Castle began. It appears in many films and inspired the castle in Wolfenstein. It was Himmler's residence. Initially, it was meant to be an SS school, a forge for SS cadres, with a university and training camp. Why was this castle chosen? Karl Maria Willigut, who traced his lineage to Thor, sold Himmler the idea that it was near major Germanic sanctuaries, the Teutoburg Forest, where Germanic tribes defeated Roman legions, and Externstein, ancient cult stones. Nearby grew the Irminsul tree, revered by ancient Germans, but cut down by Charlemagne during Christianization, which supposedly suppressed the Germanic race. Near these sanctuaries stood Wilsberg Castle. Himmler began building an SS school there, then turned it into his residence. The Black Order of the SS emerged, as Himmler saw the SS not just as a military or guard unit, but as a monastic brotherhood. The famous SS Death's Head ring, made of silver with the SS runes and the owner's name, was personally presented by Himmler for great achievements. These rings are now rare and sought by numismatists. If a member died, the ring was returned to Wilsberg and kept in a crypt for fallen heroes. Losing or selling it was forbidden, it belonged to the order. Himmler saw the SS as a monastic order, teaching runes for luck, protection, and battlefield powers. Herbert Jankuhn lectured SS members on ancient Germanic ways, claiming ancestral swords granted superpowers. The Spear of Longinus copy was kept in Himmler's office, covered in runes. I visited the castle once. It was blown up in 1945 as the Soviet army approached, but the North Tower, where everything happened, was restored. The tower has multiple levels, a crypt below for SS heroes and a circular hall above with a dome and 48 windows, the Hall of the Holy Grail, with an eternal flame. Its pipes remain. The Black Sun mosaic, a Tibetan symbol, is still on the floor. Wilsberg is open to tourists, and while I don't believe in mystical secrets in its basements, the place has a bad energy, likely from the fanatical and deranged people who gathered there. Himmler made it his residence, planning to rebuild it into a triangle resembling the Spear of Longinus, steeped in symbolism he obsessively cultivated. His connection to Tibet led Hitler to dabble in yoga and Hinduism, preparing to lead a new world order. Runes and artifacts were brought to the castle. In 1945, it was blown up but later restored and is now visitable. The Death's Head rings and Spear of Destiny were kept there. There's also a legend about a mythical battle at the last birch tree near the castle, where the Western civilization clashed with the Eastern one in ancient times, splitting into two tribes, with the Eastern tribe trying to engulf the Germanic nation. A story shrouded in mystery. Himmler was crafting a new religion. The H department, handling witches and their 30,000 European records, was conspiratorial and mystical, while the M department, led by a man named Boz, was practical, focusing on mathematics. Ahnenerbe members were embedded in all Third Reich technological projects. By the war's end, the Third Reich made significant advances. The first Messerschmitt jet, the V-2 rocket, near completion of a nuclear reactor, and almost developed biological weapons. Ahnenerbe members were involved, accessing archives and contributing to developments. Some say they were excluded, but documents suggest Himmler placed his people in these projects. What happened to them? They didn't disappear. The archives went to the Allies. Boz, head of Department M, vanished after the war. Wolfram Sievers, Ahnenerbe's head, was tried not at Nuremberg but later, listed among 2,000 to 2,100 punishable individuals, and was hanged, possibly because he held information deemed too sensitive. The Americans ran operations Overcast and Paperclip, smuggling German scientists and Ahnenerbe members to the US despite a congressional ban. These operations and Ahnenerbe archives remain classified in the US and likely elsewhere. Himmler didn't face justice. In 1945, loyal Heinrich began secret talks with the Allies through intermediaries, even contacting the World Jewish Congress, despite orchestrating the Holocaust, offering help and freeing 100,000 Jews as a goodwill gesture to save himself. Hitler learned of these talks, which is why he didn't name Himmler his successor. Himmler fled with fake documents, but was caught by 2 Soviet soldiers, handed to the Allies, revealed his identity, and died by biting a cyanide capsule during interrogation, escaping Nuremberg. Sievers was hanged later. Most other Ahnenerbe members, like Urjo von Gronhagen, lived long lives, some until 2003, continuing academic or scientific work or fleeing to Latin America. Rudolf Levin, head of the H Department for Paranormal Research and which catalogs, vanished in 1945, possibly smuggled out by the Allies or living under a new identity in Latin America. The archives went to the Allies, the castle was blown up and restored, and that's where Ahnenerbe's story ends. But I'd like to mention one more thing often linked to Ahnenerbe, though it may or may not be connected. There's a story not directly tied to Ahnenerbe, though many believe it is the story of New Swabia. There's a theory that Hitler didn't burn himself, shoot himself, or take poison. Instead, he escaped to Latin America or Antarctica. There's an old conspiracy theory about an Antarctic Reich. In 1938 to 1939, the German Polar Research Society sent an expedition to Antarctica on the ship Schwaben, equipped with a seaplane called Daria that could land on ice and be hoisted back aboard. They explored Queen Maud Land, found karst caves, and documented it. Why? Germany was claiming part of this unclaimed continent, believing their Viking ancestors had sailed there. This expedition returned with scientific data, planning polar stations. That's what we know for sure. Where does the conspiracy come from? In 1947, 2 years after the war, the Americans launched Operation Hyjamp, fearing Soviet airbases in Antarctica could threaten New York. During this expedition, several people died and a ship crashed. Years later, press leaks claimed that when the Americans arrived, flying saucers with swastikas emerged from under the water, attacking with lasers and sinking 5 ships. This New Swabia was supposedly the Third Reich, which, after losing the war, used submarines to transport Hitler, Ahnenerbe archives, and the elite, merging with aliens to gain extraterrestrial technology by collecting these artifacts. This civilization allegedly went under Antarctica's ice, creating New Swabia. Online, you'll find countless theories and articles proving this, citing American losses during Hyjamp. There are stories of German flying saucers, unfinished weapons, and devices altering geomagnetic fields to cause earthquakes. This is a Pandora's box of mystical and conspiratorial ideas tied to Ahnenerbe. But this half-mystical, half-occult, yet fully criminal organization, which conducted practical research, truly existed. That's how it began, and that's how it ended. Finally, about the man who started it all, Rudolf von Sebetendorf, who founded the Thule Society, which birthed Ahnenerbe. In the 1940s, he fell out of favor, his mysticism and occultism annoying everyone, and ended up in Istanbul. Some say he worked as a spy for the Abwehr, providing intelligence, or perhaps he just fled there to practice occultism. We don't know. What we do know is that in 1945, after Germany's defeat, he threw himself into the Bosphorus and took his own life. That's the story of Ahnenerbe, perhaps the most secretive and mystical organization of the Third Reich. I've tried to cover everything I found, from the mystical to the practical. It was a truly terrifying institute, far from the playful computer games or fun Indiana Jones movies. It was a very real structure. Thank you.